I'm glad we're recording. So they could talk about the laws as they were existing on the ground. So for example, in California, people pretty much assumed that all of the laws were based on the non-disclosure law with intent to transmit. In fact, that was not the case. 95% of enforcement in California was under the sex worker law, and so people didn't realize that. And so everybody kind of assumed it was like, oh, white gay men fighting with each other, and in fact it was like mostly black women who were being arrested and prosecuted under these laws. So it sort of changed the conversation and was allowing people to really see what was happening in real life. So because of that, you guys reached out and asked if we could do similar research in Georgia. So we did our first report, we put it out a few weeks ago, and I'm actually looking to do a second report also. So what would be really helpful from you guys is if anyone knows of a doctor or healthcare provider or public health person who has expertise in both HIV and hepatitis, we did a report that specifically looked at the legal language of the law and transmission risk, and how much of the law is actually criminalizing something that has a real risk of transmission. So I would like to be able to do that report for Georgia as well. So what I'm going to do tonight is just go over the results of this report. Think of it as your crib sheet, so you don't have to read it. And then at the very end, I have a few sort of like things that catch people when they're trying to talk about data that we often, it's not intuitive, and so even statisticians will make mistakes when they describe the data, so I'm going to try to put some of those on your radar. But I mentioned earlier, if ever you guys are wanting to talk about the data or write about the data and you're not sure you're saying it right, you can always send it to me, and I'm happy to just look at it and let you know, yeah, that's accurate, no problem. And then if we have time, which we probably won't, I can talk about some broader issues about immigration and LGBT issues and stuff like that as they relate to HIV crime, but I think we're going to run out of time. Okay, so I'm going to go until the hour, is that right?
You have some time. You have about 35, 40 minutes.
Oh, okay, right.
Including
I'm a little tired, so. Okay, I also got up at 4 this morning to be out here tonight, so if I can't add, that would be why. All right, I'm going to assume that I can go until about 10 after.
Yeah.
Okay. I still think I did the math wrong on that. I did. Okay.
I got you.
Yeah. Like wave when it's time for me to sit down. And I'll do that. Okay. Like I said, ask questions, but we can also ask questions at the end.
I got it.
Okay.
Okay, I'm gonna click for you.
Okay.
Oh, maybe it's not.
Oh.
That was
This is like the wave part that I think.
That was it.
All right. We can make this work. Okay. Yes. All right. So I think you guys probably all know this very well, that HIV criminalization is an issue all across the United States. Almost every state either has an HIV-specific law or has used non-HIV-specific laws to prosecute people based on their HIV status. These are the laws here in Georgia. Should I assume a general knowledge of the laws, or do you want me to go over them?
I think you all have a general knowledge.
General knowledge. Okay. So I'll just do a very quick, because it seems like you guys already know, it's divided sort of into two major subsections, right? There's the reckless conduct subsection, which is about potential exposure, and then there's the assault by a person living with HIV or hepatitis on a police or correctional officer, and that one requires intent to transmit. So the earlier one, the reckless conduct one, divided into 5 subsections, which are about sexual exposure, exposure through needles, or drugs, and solicitation. The blood donation one and stuff like that, what I found in California is that it was never actually prosecuted, and my guess would be that that's the case here as well. So none of the laws here require any transmission, right? Nothing requires proof of any transmission, and a lot of the criminalized conduct may have little or no risk of transmission depending upon the facts of the underlying case. So, for example, solicitation is an agreement to engage in something, right? It's not actual sex or contact of any kind. In California, a person can be picked up for solicitation if they have a conversation and exchange money. Clearly, you cannot expose someone to HIV by having a conversation and exchanging money. So there's all different kinds of ways where these laws may think that they are preventing exposure, but they might be attacking something that actually has no risk of exposure. Only if the assault provisions, that second set of laws, requires intent to transmit, and of those, there have been 26 arrests since the law was passed, which I believe was in 2003, and only 1 conviction. So in the entire time the law has been in existence, there's only been one conviction under a law requiring to show intent to transmit. So when I go into the details of the data, I just want to clarify something up front, which is that the assault section can be HIV or hepatitis. After talking to folks here, we decided that it was going to be clearer and cleaner for this coalition to just do an analysis of HIV-specific incidents. And so essentially, if someone was arrested under the assault transmission, or the assault section, the only reason I would keep them in the data is if I saw either in the same incident or in an earlier incident an HIV-specific arrest. So if I couldn't prove that they had had some sort of HIV-specific arrest at some point up to that point, I excluded them. So that means that there may have been some people living with HIV who got excluded from this analysis, and it only resulted in 2 people from that assault section actually being included in the analysis. That doesn't mean that there were only 2 people living with HIV under that assault section. It just means that I couldn't definitively tell. So when I'm talking about these data, I'm only talking about 2 assault incidents. So generally speaking, I'm talking about the reckless conduct. Okay. So I just want to put that out there. So who's actually being impacted by the laws in Georgia? So to start just looking at trends over time, what you'll see is there were 543 people who've been arrested under HIV-specific laws. Now, I pulled that data. I was able to get it from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation in November. So that data goes through the 3rd quarter of 2017. Okay, so actually pretty recent. And there were 571 arrests. So that means a few people had more than 1 incident. No one had more than 2 incidents, and it was very rare. 95% of people who have arrests under these laws were arrested once under the laws, and that's it. Okay. So looking at race and sex, this was actually not what I expected to see. So it's very small and probably hard for you to read from where you're sitting. But the blue bars are the arrest bars, and the sort of lighter blue bars, that's not clear. Sorry, the dark blue bars are the arrests. The lighter blue bars are the overall population of people living with HIV in Georgia. So what you see is that it actually looks pretty similar. So black men are more likely than white men to be arrested under an HIV-specific law, and black women are more likely to be arrested than white women under an HIV-specific law, but they're also more likely to be living with HIV. So that disparity there isn't actually that different than what you would expect based on the overall population of people living with HIV in the state. Yes?
Do you have the number of arrests?
The number?
The number of people?
I can look that up. I have percentages up here.
Yes. I'm just curious if you have the actual number.
I do.
Okay. I'll look at it.
Yeah, if you, anything that I can't answer today, I'm gonna,
yes.
I'm gonna write it down, and then I can email out anything. And actually, that may be, the raw numbers might be in the report. So if I don't have it in the report, which I most likely do, then I can send it. The one place where we actually see a disparity was kind of surprising. It was white women. So only 3% of people living with HIV in Georgia are white women, but 11% of the people who were arrested under HIV criminal laws were white women. So that's unexpected. Oh, that's not come out at all. Okay. So unfortunately, the coloring on the map is not showing up very well.
Oh, yeah, it's not showing. It's showing on the computer, but it's not showing on the projector.
Not showing on the projector. Okay, so probably folks on the phone can see just fine.
Folks on the phone can see perfect.
And you guys, sorry, you got the short end of the stick. What can I say? So essentially, this was a map that was supposed to show where these laws are enforced throughout the state. What I can tell you is that 79 out of 159 counties have enforced HIV criminal laws at some point. And it's kind of not surprising that the majority, not the majority, but the highest enforcement was in Fulton County, which is also where the most people living with HIV live. But when you actually look at distribution across the state, it was much lower than would have been expected. And there's actually enforcement happening in really rural areas where you have like 30 people living with HIV and 2 or 3 of them have been arrested. So it was kind of looking kind of strange. What we found was that, so I looked at Metro Atlanta area. I had to look by county. That was the most granular that the data could get. But I aggregated DeKalb, Cobb, Gwinnett, Clayton, and Fulton counties. And what we found was that within those counties, 0.4% of all of the people living with HIV had been arrested at some point under those laws. Outside of those counties, 1.3% of people have been arrested. That means you're 3 times more likely to be arrested in an HIV-specific offense if you're outside of the metro Atlanta area. So this is just showing that disparity there. So what you see is the brown bars are, again, the percent of people living with HIV in the state. The red bars are the percent of enforcement. So you see Fulton is way underrepresented in terms of enforcement based on what you would expect. Because 32% of people living with HIV live in Fulton County, but only 17% of the arrests happen there. And also DeKalb County is way underrepresented. 17% of people, I don't know that. 17% of the people living with HIV are in DeKalb County, but only 3% of the arrests are there. And then you see overrepresentation in places like, I'm not going to pronounce this right, Muskogee. Did I get it right? Muskogee, Cobb, Chatham, overrepresentation in other places. So even though you see these overrepresentations, it's still kind of hard to tell the differences. So what I did was I went down to the county level, and I said, okay, well, let's look at these counties where there are like almost nobody living with HIV and see what's happening. And what we found was there were some weird counties out there. What was happening was there were places where more than 5% of the people living with HIV in that county had been arrested under the laws of some point. That's really, really high. That means 1 in 20 people was arrested under the law. There was one county that was, I think, like 10%. So I didn't look at counties that only had 1 arrest for 2 reasons. One is because with 1 arrest, like, what does that really say about percentages? And also because I want to protect people's privacy. But these are counties that might have like 30 or fewer people living with HIV in them and are having multiple arrests happening. And you can see it's kind of clustered in the northern part of the state. I don't know Georgia well enough to know what that means, but I hope you guys do and can talk about that. Yeah.
And Charles, just the number for black men, the actual number is 247. White women is 71. White men is 178. Black women is 2, and 3 Asian males.
Yeah. So the other thing I can tell you is there was no one labeled in the data as Latino. Now, coming from California, I think that's bizarre. It may just be...
That's bizarre here, too. It's really significant, like, population.
Yeah. So I thought that was very strange. When I talked to folks on the phone, you guys said it may be that officers just kind of look at people and they're like, white, black.
Yeah.
And they just kind of like put you in a box.
Yeah. Latino considered ethnicity minorities. So you either white, understand, or black.
Well, under the census, that's definitely how they do it, but in the police records, they do have an option to just check Latino. Like that's one of their options, but in the data that I was getting, I wasn't getting anything. So maybe they were using census measures in the way that they were categorizing people. I'm not 100% sure what was happening there. I'm guessing there's some inaccuracy there, but I have to report the data as they come. And yeah, I think there was 3 Asian Americans?
Yeah, 3.
Okay. So,
I have a question about these.
yeah.
Is it possible to see, like, arresting officer, or, like, who presses the charges? I'm curious to me, like, if there's just, like, individual people in these counties who have, like, a personal stake.
Which is possible. I definitely don't have the data, and in fact, I had to promise when I received the data that I wouldn't do anything at the precinct level. I can do the lowest level that I can go is the county level. So while that may be the case, I can't do an analysis at that level. Any other questions? All right. So this graph is a little weird. So stop me if you. And nothing is showing up well. I'm sorry, guys. I really tried to like bold and it's not working. Okay. So I'll just tell you what this is saying. So essentially, at the beginning, we talked about the reckless conduct statute and how it has 5 sections, right? So we have a section on blood donation. Let's just leave that one aside. We have 2 sections related to sex work, 1 related to drugs, and 1 related to sexual exposure. So what I did was, the data aren't divided by that. They don't say which subsection of the statute you're arrested under, and I was trying to figure out what's happening, right? Because in California, that actually made a big difference when we looked at that. So the only thing I could do was look at what other things people were arrested for at the same time that they were arrested for an HIV offense. And so that could point to what subsection it was under. So essentially, if they were arrested for a drug offense at the same time, I said, well, maybe this is the needle sharing subsection. If they were also arrested for a sexual assault offense, I put it under the sexual exposure. And if they were also arrested for a sex work offense, I put it under the sex work grouping. right? So what we found is that for most of them, we don't have any additional information. So the red here means they were arrested for the reckless conduct offense and nothing else. So we have no further information. All we know is that they were arrested for the reckless conduct offense by itself. This big bottom section here means they were arrested for the reckless conduct offense and something that just doesn't make sense. Now, it may, or that's not, it either just doesn't make sense or that wasn't pointing to drugs, sex, or sex work. So it could be that they were arrested for that and assault. People could say, well, you know, they were, or like it could have been that and resisting arrest, right? Like those are things that aren't necessarily related to the underlying HIV offense, but could be connected to the arrest that happened. Sometimes there were ones that just didn't make sense, like check fraud. Those are probably miscodes, but I couldn't find any consistent errors in the data to be able to exclude them, so I included them. And then this last quarter up here, these are the ones that had some sort of concurrent offense that was under one of those three sections. So we found is nearly half, 49%, had a concurrent drug offense among this 25%. So right, you're talking about a small group here. 29% had a concurrent sex offense, and 29% had a concurrent sex work offense. And those don't add up to 100% because some had more than one. Okay, so just overall outcomes, which are not up on the board there. 67% of the 67% of the incidents that had HIV arrests had no conviction, not under HIV, not under anything else. 13% had a conviction under that HIV-specific offense, and 19% were convicted of something, but not that HIV-specific offense. So the way I categorize it, I put it in these three boxes. If you're convicted of that HIV offense and something else, you still go in that top red bar, which is the HIV conviction. Does that make sense? Okay. So then I broke it down by race and sex. And what I found surprised me because I was expecting to see like crazy disparities like we saw in California. And there are disparities here, but they're not the insanity that I was expecting. The biggest disparity that we saw actually was among men. What we found is that black men were nearly twice as likely as white men to be convicted under an HIV-specific offense. But white men were actually more likely to be convicted under some other offense, so their non-conviction rates ended up to be similar.
Do you know how many of these non-convictions and increased plea deals? I'm wondering if these HIV charges are being used by prosecutors to get leverage in the plea deals.
Well, my assumption would be that a plea deal would still show up in the data as a conviction because the data just says guilty or not. That's all it says. Like it's a 0 or a 1, guilty or not. Yes.
Do you know how long the average time for a waiting trial was?
I have no idea. Okay. That is not in the data. I can't even get sentencing data out of them. They said the sentencing data is so inconsistent that they wouldn't send me anything. So, and you know, let me think. I'm trying to think if I have dates on the contact. I could look at that because I may have like the date of arrest and then the date that it says guilty or not. The problem is I would have to look at it because I think that sometimes it's hard for me to tell the difference between an arrest and a contact later on down the line. But I can try to check at that. So length of pretrial wait.
We do have a question coming from the phone, and that question is there data on trans people specific in this research?
No, unfortunately, because we're using police data, they just categorize people as male, female. So it's however the police categorize them, which my assumption is I really don't know. They might be looking at people's ID, or they might just kind of look you up and down and go, yep, you're in this box, right? Like, I don't actually know how they're categorizing folks, and so we kind of just have to go with what the data say. And that's something that's very frustrating about these data. If I do it in any state, no state records gender identity. So I can never talk specifically about the experiences of trans people when I do this. Okay. So then, yes.
Tony, I just unmuted you. I see you have a follow-up question. You can go ahead. Tony Michelle, are you there? No. Okay, I want to do the follow-up.
Oh, I'm sorry. I had my mute. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me now? I was wondering where did you find, especially for the sex worker percentages, where were the most arrests happening? I know it's like a accumulation of like Georgia, but like in what prisons or areas did were the most arrests taking place?
The geographic area?
Yes, like I know it's specific to Georgia, but like were you I kind of came on late, but were you talking about like a specific county or a specific jail population that this research came out of?
So I looked at Georgia as a whole. I didn't subdivide it down based on the arrests that also had concurrent sex work convictions. Sorry, I'm looking at that, but I should probably talk into the microphone. So yeah, I didn't actually look at that, but that's something I could look at. Just doing quick math in my head, if there were approximately 600 incidents, we only have 25% with that concurrent data, and only 29% of those were concurrent with sex work. That comes out to something around 50 incidents. But I could look at those 50 incidents to see if they seem to be concentrated in one geographic area.
Please?
Yeah.
That would be great.
Thank you for that question, Tony Michelle.
Thank y'all.
Okay. Yeah. Some of these questions are like the wait time and the geographic distribution are not going to be quick analyses, but they are things I can look into. But it might take a few weeks for me to get back to you, but I will get back to you. So what I did do, though, was I looked at conviction rates based on those three categories, right? So again, we're looking at smaller groups here. We're just looking at the incidents that had a concurrent offense that was either related to sex work, sex, or drugs. So this first one here was looking at those that had concurrent sex offenses. What we found was, and this kind of isn't super surprising, they were actually much more likely to have a conviction under the HIV offense than those that did not have a concurrent sex offense, and less likely to be convicted for other things. But granted, in this red bar up here on the top, again, if they could have been convicted for the HIV offense and the sex work offense in those groups. When we looked at drug offenses, what we found was actually they were less likely to be convicted for the HIV offense than in the non-drug offense groups, but more likely to be convicted for something else, probably the drug offense, right? But the group that was really the most disparate and really looked different was the sex workers. So what we saw was this is sex workers here on the right, for those of you on the phone. Look at that really low non-conviction rate, 26%. In the overall group, the non-conviction rate was 67%. That's a huge difference. And they were more likely to be convicted for the HIV offense and more likely to be convicted for something else. Yeah.
Were you able to, was there any information available about the demographics of the sex workers?
Yeah, I'm going to get to that on the next slide. Good question.
And I also wanted to call out Tony Michelle. I wanted to point to this particular slide. Even though I know that Amira is going to go back and answer your specific question, I just wanted you to see this one as well, about the incidents for sex work.
Yeah. So, Charles, right? Yeah. So to answer your question, this is the demographics of those people who had the concurrent sex work incident. And what you see is a really high percentage of black women, right? So what this is the bars on the red on the left is the distribution of people who did not have a concurrent sex work incident. The distribution of the bars on the right, the brown bars, are people who did have a sex work incident. What you see is, I mean, not surprisingly, you see more women than men in general, but a really high percent, almost half of those people were black women, 49%. So even though we're not seeing overall disparate outcomes, if you look at the group as a whole, when you're looking at sex workers, you are seeing a difference, and you're seeing that that is going to be disproportionately impacting black women.
Wait, so this, comparing the people who were charged, convicted?
Arrested.
Okay.
Arrested. So with the data that I got from Georgia, the only information I have is arrest and then guilty or not.
Okay.
So I can't tell you anything about who was charged versus dismissed. I can't tell you anything about like probation or pleas or anything like that. All I know is arrest, and then it says guilty, 0-1. That's what I get.
I'm having a hard time wrapping my brain around this slide, and I think it's just because I'm really tired. So would you mind just explaining it again?
It's a little complicated. Let me do it one more time. I might not have explained it well. Okay, so essentially we have our whole group of people who were arrested, right? And then there's that small group who had a concurrent sex work offense, right? So what I did was I took the people who had the sex work offense, I put them in one box, and I put everybody else in another box. And I said, okay, what's the demographic distribution of the non-sex work group, and what's the demographic distribution of the sex work group? The bars on the left, the red bars, are the demographic distribution of the non-sex work group. So what you see is among the non-sex work group, we were most likely to have black men, right? And we saw that in the overall group, right? Like black men were the most likely to be arrested under HIV-specific laws in Georgia. But if you look at that smaller sex worker group, the most likely to be in the group were black women.
Okay. I get it now. Thank you. I appreciate it.
This is really important.
Yeah. Okay. I feel like you have another question. Yeah.
Yes. Do you also have the numbers in the report of the actual numbers of people, the raw data?
I might not have the raw data on this one, but I'll pull it. I don't think that the raw numbers are in the report. The other thing is, I mean, it's fine. You can extrapolate the numbers based on the overall numbers, but I can definitely pull that for you. Let's see. Okay. And I really do make an effort in the report to, like, if you're really bored and detail oriented, you can read all of the endnotes, and you should be able to follow exactly how all the analyses went, so that if somebody were to be handed the same data, they should be able to find all the same answers that I did. I try to keep this concept. Okay, so talking about the data, as you can see from that last graph, sometimes it gets a little confusing and gets a little weird, and I am not a Georgian, and I don't want to presume that I should go to your legislator and say, here's what I know about Georgia, and here's what you guys should do, right? Like, I'm a Yankee, I'm from Massachusetts, I live in California now. I'm sure legislators just love to ream me. It's fine, that's why I'm here, telling you guys about this, that you can take these numbers and you guys are going to know who to talk to and what's going to be the most important facts for them to know, right? I'm not going to know that. So what I'm here to do is try to help you to know and understand the data well enough that you can talk about it as though you were the researcher yourself, okay, as though you were me. So one thing to think about is people versus incidents. So when I do the overall, like when I talk about the number of people, that's people. When I talk about the demographics, I'm actually looking at the incident level because one person may have been arrested more than once, right? So it depends on what we're looking at, whether we're looking at people versus incidents. Usually when we talk about outcomes, that's going to be at the incident level, right? Because one person might have been convicted once and acquitted once, right? Or dismissed once, or whatever it is. So just sometimes that gets a little confusing. So again, just going back to the very beginning, 543 people, 571 incidents. So it's a slight difference. And an incident, who is the denominator? This gets really confusing. So when we're talking about what's happening, often we're saying out of this group, right? So whatever group we're talking about out of, that's the denominator. So when I talk about the Metro Atlanta area versus the non-Metro Atlanta area, we were looking at out of the people within the Metro Atlanta area versus out of the people who are outside the Metro Atlanta area. But then when I talked about within the counties, right, then I said among the people who are just in this county, like 10% of the people in that county were arrested. So it can be a little bit confusing. Again, this is something that I'm not sure I can explain in 10 minutes really well tonight, but if issues come up where you're like, wait, how am I supposed to talk about that? If it's not clear from the report, I'm just a phone call away. You can always call me and I can talk you through it. And again, that's the same thing. It's also comparing within versus comparing across, right? We compared across the state sometimes, and then we looked inside of the county sometimes. We compared between different groups, like the sex worker versus non, and then we looked within the sex worker group to look at that demographic distribution. So just who we're talking about. And yeah, if all else fails, call me. I should have, I think the phone number is, I didn't put my phone number in. Okay, ready? Everybody got a pen?
I'm going to add it right now on the screen.
Yeah, put it up on the screen.
Hold on a second.
And this is my direct line. You don't even have to talk to the secretary at the Williams Institute.
It'll be there.
Okay. Do you need it or do you have it?
Yeah, I'm going to write it. Give me 1 second. Okay. What's your phone number?
It's 825 1198.
And we go back to that slide. It should be there.
Were the slides in the invite email?
Yes. Mm-hmm. it'll refresh. It's really there for whatever reason.
Yeah.
Okay.
You can also email me. I respond to emails too, so that's also fine too. And if it's a really complicated question, it might be better to email me first, because if it's something where I was telling folks before, like if you talk to a legislator or like a local person who's like, oh, I want to know what's happening in my county, I can run a sub-analysis within a county and tell you more information about what's happening there. So, I have other projects on my plate. I can't always do things like the second I get asked, but I can do the best I can to try to get you a turnaround, depending upon how complicated the question is, within a day or two. If it's a really complicated question, it might take a couple of weeks to get through it. But the data were actually pretty clean in Georgia, so it didn't take a ton to do the analysis. I have more slides, but let's just stop and do questions, and you'll tell me how the timing is. Because the other slides are more general about HIV criminalization.
I think one of the fears in here is, as we sort of talk about, I guess, the proportions. So, like, white women being more proportionally impacted. We want to make sure that that's not the conversation that we're leading with, because black men are still, 3 times more likely to be convicted under the statute. So, what do you recommend in terms of, as we're presenting the data? Should we be presenting the percentages along with the raw data to show sort of the balance? Because I know definitely with some of our African American legislators that we've been, really trying to get on board. I think it's really important for them to see like the impact within, the specific community. So do you recommend using the raw data, or just what are your thoughts, I guess?
So my thoughts are, I always tailor, so this is a generic presentation.
Right.
I tailor everything, when I'm going to talk to a legislator, I tailor it to that legislator. So if you're talking to a conservative legislator who wants to protect the poor white women of Georgia, lead with the white women, right? If you're talking to black legislators who care about their community, then lead with that information. And it doesn't even necessarily have to be the raw data, right? You can use the raw numbers, those are helpful, but you can also say more than half the people criminalized under these laws are black, right? Even if that is proportionate to HIV rates, it still means that more than half the people are being criminalized under these laws are black, right? So there's different ways to add and subtract and frame it that are going to be more appealing and interesting to some legislators versus others. And if you think the raw numbers are going to be the most, if you can say over 200 people, right? If that's what's going to really tug at someone's heartstrings, then say that. And I don't know like in California, I know like when we talk to Holly Mitchell, the first thing I'm talking about is how this is impacting black women, right? Like it just depends on who you're talking to. So, I think that having both at your fingertips and knowing, and you can also try it with like, they say there's something called like the grandma test, which is like, if you explain to your grandma, would she understand and would it impact her? And so you can always like talk to somebody who's, we're in this all the time, right? Like sometimes it doesn't strike us the way that it strikes somebody who never talks about it. So find somebody who, you think is sort of a constituent of that person, or who would represent that person's feelings, and try a few different things and see which one they're like, whoa. When you hear that, whoa, you're like, okay, that's the one you leave with, right? Yeah.
So now, for specific causes, there's like a minimum of 5 years saying that, saying 8 years probation for parole. I think I'm trying to figure out what is like the average bail set, and then or are people allowed to post bail for HIV-related offenses? That the rate of conviction is low. I think I'm coming at it from different angles. Like people are going to be held in jail for a long time, and they're still presumed innocent. And if the conviction rate is still really low, these people are being held in jail to cost the state. And it's in large cost to like their own personal familial financial status. And their own long-term status, financial status as well.
I completely understand where you're coming from in theory with those things. I don't have numbers about how, bail, all of that kind of stuff is not in the data that I work with. I can tell you that one thing that folks tried to do in California was the opposite side of that. So if you're trying to make a fiscal, right, so you brought up 2 different arguments. You talked about the cost of the state and then the cost of the individual being held in jail and being taken away from their family and probably losing their jobs and all these other things while they're still just waiting for their trial. So those are two different issues. In terms of the financial cost to the state, what we looked at was, and we have sentencing data, so it's a little different. But if we go back, we go all the way back to the beginning here.
Sure.
Okay.
Tony, that question was two-part. If you wouldn't mind kind of repeating your question and being a little louder so folks.
Okay. I think the things I was interested in, earlier I mentioned, however, what was the average time awaiting trial, but also what was the average amount of bail that was allowed to be posted, or that was posted or assigned to the person. And then, because there's a minimum amount of sentencing, maximum sentencing, along with convictions and parole. But for me, I was concerned about, if there's a low overall conviction rate, and people are being held in jail for years because they can't afford to pay the bill set at a high point, it's costing the state a lot of money, and it's also costing people a lot of money who are presumed to be innocent.
Right. So, and my answer was I can't really speak much to the bail stuff. I don't have a lot of information on that, and that may be something that, folks here in Georgia could look into in terms of what the average bail is, and, maybe talking to some people who do that. I really, it's not something that I have more information on. But in terms of costs of the state, one of the things that we had tried to do was we looked at sentence length. Now, we don't have sentence length here, but that you have a felony up to 10 years, and I think you mentioned right off the bat, you knew how long the minimum, I don't know what a minimum felony sentence is here. In California, it's the minimum of a year. So if you know that it's a felony and that if you're convicted, you're going to be in jail for a minimum of a year, right? You can calculate, so the California Legislative Office has a calculation for the cost of imprisoning a person for 1 year. And there are some estimates out there for the cost of HIV medication in prison for a year. So you add those two together and you have the cost of imprisoning a person living with HIV to the state. And then you get our numbers of people who are convicted, and you can put a minimum on that. You could do a minimum and a maximum, right? If you know that they had to be a minimum of 1 year and they could have been up to 10 years, then you can do 1 to 10, right? And sort of extrapolate that out. Yeah.
Can I add to that question?
Go ahead.
As far as the bail piece, what I wanted to add is in the city of Atlanta, for folks who are convicted of solicitation or island loitering, which is what they usually book or convict sex workers in the city for, whether they're picked up in, if they're picked up in Midtown or in District 2, District 6, in those areas. Bail is usually between $200 and $400 for the city charge. Now, what we found with trans women, SNAPCO, is what happens is that if they are, if they don't have ID, or if it's up to the police officer's discretion, they will usually take folks to Fulton County, to Rice Street, and charge for a solicitation or prostitution law, they'll charge the state law. And then at Rice Street is when folks are really kind of are stuck in there usually for those long times, and which is why I was asking the question around where was, I guess, the concentration areas of the sex worker arrest. Because I'm just really kind of interested in following that too. But after Monday, we did a bail reform in the city of Atlanta, and solicitation and idling and loitering is still it's still considered a violent offense, and so bail is not considered for those offenses. And again, that's what they usually book sex workers on in the city.
Sorry, did you say loitering is considered a violent offense? Did I hear that right?
Yes. Yes.
Wow. And just to clarify, are there city ordinances and then city jails that are separate from the state police system? Okay.
Absolutely.
So what that means is that my data probably don't include that, right? My data are from state data repositories. So unless those city arrests are being reported at the state level, I probably don't have any of that inside of what we're reporting on, because I got my stuff from the
and that's where it gets tricky. I think that's why I was really, really interested, because, like I said, it's usually up to the discretion of the officers, and on the streets they literally, if they for many of the stories that we have of the Black trans women that we assist is that if they feel, if they're feeling like they can, want to be a little asshole or whatever, they'll take you to Rice Street and charge you and book you on the state side, on the state conviction and not the city conviction. So I think I'm just really interested in kind of digging and diving into that a little more to see actually what the data represents.
Yeah. So I can definitely try to look into that a little more. And if I come back with stuff and you have more questions and we end up with like a lot of information that's really important, and you're like, can you put this in a fact sheet? I can make a fact sheet that you can bring to legislators. Like this is an ongoing conversation. So you don't have to feel like the one report is all we can do.
Okay, thank you. Great.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, I think leading into that fact sheet, and maybe this is something, but it would be interesting because, we represent different organizations as a coalition, and there may be specific things that are in the data that you could pull out into like a fact sheet, say that we can use on, Black gay men, or Black women, et cetera, that there could be a fact sheet that would be really helpful for our various constituents.
Yeah. So I can't talk about gay men, unfortunately, because the data doesn't have anything about sexual orientation. I can talk about Black men, I can talk about Black women. And the other thing is, anything, you can also make it, like, you don't have to wait for me. Like, if you're like, we have all the information we need here in the report, you can put that into something on your own also. Of course, I can do that too, but you don't have to feel like, you guys are empowered to do that, and you have all the information at your fingertips, and the whole point is for us to give the facts to you. And if you want to put something, stronger about advocacy in that fact sheet, I can't do that. Right? The Williams Institute is a research center alone. We don't advocate. So if you want to put stronger language in there, and then you want the Williams Institute name on it, I'm going to be like, sorry, we can't do that. So, you can think about what's going to be most effective for who you're using this for, and it may be more effective for it to be coming from, the Counter-Narrative Project or Georgia Equality, and having stronger language and just pulling, and then all you have to do is cite to the Williams Institute data, right? You can always do that. But again, if there are additional questions that you have that weren't answered in that report that are going to be more helpful for those kinds of fact sheets, I can always do more analysis and then do another, individualized fact sheet.
Do we have any additional questions?
I do. I'm trying to find it. So the data that we're looking at, what's the end goal? Is it just to have less arrests, larger sentences, or is it criminalize it altogether?
That's the question for you guys, right? Like, that's the whole thing of, like, I'm not the advocate, I'm the researcher, I can provide the data, I can tell you that, California used the data to change the laws, right? And they completely repealed the sex worker felony. That's no longer on the books, and they were able to put an expungement part into the statute, so anybody who had been a sex worker who had been convicted of the felony in the past could have that removed from their record. I don't know what this is, like, you guys know the political situation and political climate in Georgia. Maybe that's just not feasible here. Maybe that's not your goal. Maybe you guys have a different goal, and that's okay. That's for you all to decide, and I'm just here to provide the information so that you can use it as a tool in whatever your path is.
And to provide some context from the coalition standpoint, the goal of the coalition is to, be able to modernize Georgia's HIV criminalization laws. And so being able to use this data for leading along that purpose, right? So being able to have conversations with elected officials, and also to be able to have conversations with the community about what's happening. So that's the way we're viewing this, being able to use this data. Okay.
I think it's not a time, right? Okay.
Yeah, we have a few other things to discuss. Thank you so much, Amira, for
Yes, Amira.
Yeah. So really quickly, we want to do a 5-minute break. Folks want to take grab something to drink really quick, and then we'll come back here at 8:30, and we'll move into the next phase of the meeting. So for folks on the phone, you can take a quick